Welcome to the breakdowns for the PFL Super Fights pay-per-view that goes down this weekend. There are 9 fights sprinkled all throughout the card, but it is headlined by a heavyweight matchup between Francis Ngannou and Renan Ferreira, not to mention a couple other super fights in the form of Chris Cyborg and Larissa Pacheco. A fun super fights between prospects, if you want to call it that, between AJ McKee and Paul Hughes, but not to mention the rematch for the middleweight title as we have Johnny Eblen going up against Fabian Edwards once again. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, and your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, ensuring you leave no stone unturned for these upcoming MMA events, as we have over 4,500 fighter profiles for you to browse through so you can do your research and trust that you have as many direct links to past fights for all these competitors so that you are ready to predict matchups, break down fights, provide some analysis, whether you're commentating on the fight, whether you're a coach for one of the fighters, whether you're a fighter looking to get some more information on your opponent. The MMA Fight Archive is your best one-stop shop to ensure that you get as much information as you possibly can on these fighters. And we cover 17 different promotions from all over the world. So make sure you guys check it out and take advantage of the 7-day free trial that we have available so you can see what all the hoopla is about and why we are close to surpassing 100 subscribers on the service. All right, like I said, PFL breakdowns coming right at you. We got 9 fights to talk about. I do also want to remind you that I do have LFA and KSW breakdowns coming as well, but those will strictly be in written form on the MMALOTN Lock of the Night Patreon page, which is in the description below. So if you want an appetizer to this PFL and UFC card on the weekend, that is the best way to do so. Check it out, the MMALOTN Patreon page. All right. I will break down these 9 fights for you guys in brief fashion here. Not going to get as in-depth as I normally do with the UFC fights. So without further ado, let's get right into it. First fight of the night, Tariq Ismail going up against Taha Bendaoud. Probably butchering that last name. Ismail minus 170. Bendaoud coming in at plus 140. Now, Ismail is a fighter that I've been familiar with for over 10 years now. He actually trained out of a gym that I used to work at up here in the Toronto area. Solid fighter, good Muay Thai base that he originally came from, but he's been kind of hopping all over the place in terms of where he's been training. In recent years, he's been over there in Montreal at TriStar. It seems like he ended his camp over there in Thailand at Bang Tao Muay Thai for this specific training camp, and what you can normally expect from him, good striking, good straight shots down the pipe, a nasty clinch game as well. He's also been able to go out there and get some takedowns and get some good control time from that top position, but he's done a great job in terms of rounding out his game and becoming a more complete fighter rather than just banking on his Muay Thai to get wins. His opponent, Taha Bendaoud, has had a ton of fights fall out over the last year and a half, but he finally makes his PFL debut here after missing weight for PFL MENA earlier this year, where he was supposed to headline the card and take on Abdullah Al-Khatani. Misses weight, gets removed from the card, but now here he is on the PFL Super Fights. He is a striker by trade, what it seems like. He fights from a karate stance, likes to utilize a lot of kicks, very comfortable from both stances, and if he ever does get taken down, he does a good job in terms of staying active with his guard. He loves the rubber guard as well, and from there he's able to either throw up submissions or find reverse or scrambling opportunities so that he can get back to his feet, which is where he is most dangerous in the striking realm. I'm not overly impressed with his threat level in the striking realm. It seems more like he's a point fighter than actually being able to finish guys that will provide legitimate resistance to him. And he's actually facing a pretty experienced guy here compared to the other fighters that he's been facing. And I do think he's going to be behind it here, as Ismail should do a good enough job in terms of controlling the pace, landing better strikes, kind of crowding the pocket of Bendaoud, staying in his face, landing good shots down the pipe, maybe even mixing it up in the clinch here. But I do think that Ismail is the better mixed martial artist, and I think minus 170 is the pretty much an accurate line of how I believe this fight should be matched up. So I do like Ismail here, and I think he wins this fight on the scorecards. Next up, Ibragimov coming in at minus 1,400, going up against Nacho Campos, coming in at plus 800. Ibragimov training out of Manchester top team, although he does have a Dagestani background. But that's exactly how he fights. He looks to take opponents to the ground, grind them out, or find submissions, although the majority of his wins have come inside the distance, I believe he's finished all but one of those opponents. Last time around, he made his PFL debut by taking Josh Reed to the mat and submitting him in less than a minute of their fight, getting that arm triangle choke and getting the tap. And that's normally how he looks to fight. Takes opponents to the ground, finds that submission, finds that finish, and does it pretty efficiently as well. That doesn't mean he can't strike. He has some pretty good striking chops as well, some crafty and swift kicks. Also has great shots down the pipe, knows when to crash the pocket and land those straight shots. But what is best about him is his ability to mix those takedowns behind his striking, so it catches his opponents off guard, and then from there he's very difficult to deal with from that top position. Kind of makes sense why he's minus 1400 here, as he takes on the debuting Spaniard Nacho Campos, who comes from a Muay Thai background and has largely been facing guys that look to take him to the ground. There have been opponents that have had success, but not prolonged success, which eventually allows him to either throw up a submission and get that, or outlast them and land better strikes on the feet and eventually either finish them or win on the scorecards. I think that he's being brought in to do a job here against Ibragimov, who looks to be a very solid prospect and a guy that should have no trouble taking Campos to the ground and finding a finish. Obviously, minus 1400 is a prohibitive favorite, so I would not suggest throwing that type of line into a parlay. So let's try to hone in on what kind of prop would be most profitable. To me, I think it would be the submission prop, which again, it's only plus 110, so it's not, it's a little bit too short for me to be more than willing to take a specific prop like that to actually end up hitting here, but I do think that's going to be the most enticing one, considering the KO prop I think is only around about plus 140, but I do think that Ibragimov will get this fight to the ground and eventually find a submission to get the win here. Next up, McKee Zaynukov coming in at minus 455, going up against Dedrick Sanders, who comes in at plus 355. Now, Zaynukov is a part of the Nurmagomedov camp, has been training at American Kickboxing Academy as well, alongside Makhachev and Nurmagomedov when he was training as well. He's 33, maybe 34 years old by this point in time, riding a solid winning streak at this point. His losses have all come against notable fighters from the Russian scene. Also, Nurullo Aliyev, who I believe is from Tajikistan. I could be off on that, but I know he's not Russian. Regardless, Zaynukov fights exactly how you would expect. He waits for his perfect opportunity to close the distance, get opponents to the ground, and either ride them along the cage or eventually take them to the ground and do a good enough job in terms of keeping them there. Once he gets his opponents to the ground, or at least he gets a body lock on his opponents, it's very hard to normally get him off of them, which is why he's been so successful at this stage of his career. Dedrick Sanders is coming off of an upset victory over Sergio Campos back in, I believe it was September, the beginning of September. I could be off on that. It was either August or September. I think actually it was August. That was a fight where Sergio Cassio came in, he missed weight, looked horrible on the scales, and then I believe it completely affected his ability to be himself in the cage come fight night. And I think Sanders sensed that as well, which is why he put his foot on the gas and got him out of there in less than a half a round. If you guys remember, Sergio Cassio prior to that pulled off an upset against Anthony Romero, where he was able to dictate the pace and crash the pocket repeatedly over 15 minutes and get the win that night. We didn't see any of that against Sanders, and I think Sanders sensed the weakness in Cassio and was able to take full advantage of that by taking command of that fight. Sanders is a guy that largely relies on his power striking approach to hurt his opponents, or at least demand the respect, so that he can dictate the pace of most matchups. His losses have all come against fighters that are notable, at least to hardcore MMA fans, right? Like Luis Pena, Terrence McKinney, Zach Zane. There's one more that's escaping me at this moment right now, but that's Sanders' style. He can beat the no-name guys, but he might come up short against guys that are a little bit more well-rounded. And I think he's going to run into some trouble here against Zaynukov, as Zaynukov puts him through the grinder. We might see some good defense and resistance from Sanders, but I don't think he's going to have too many opportunities to let go with this power striking, as Zaynukov will do a great job in terms of crowding his space, keeping him pinned against the cage or on the mat, and end up grinding this fight out and winning it on the scorecards. Next up, Rafael Stots coming in at minus 600, going up against Marcos Breno, who comes in at plus 425. Now, starting off on the Stots side, he did pick up another victory over Danny Sabatello last time around, and that was pretty much sandwiching that loss that he had to Patchy Mix, where he ended up losing his bantamweight title. Obviously, Mix probably one of the best bantamweights on the planet, so not a bad loss to take for a guy like Stots. Stots is best in the grappling realm. He does a great job in terms of utilizing it defensively against guys that are solid grapplers so that he can touch them up on the feet, or he does a great job in terms of using it offensively against guys that are not that great of grapplers, and then from there he can stifle them or eventually find finishes as well. He goes up against Marcos Breno, who made a successful Bellator debut in August 2022 against Josh Hill, but then ended up coming up short against Danny Sabatello in April 2023, and he has been out of the cage ever since then. Breno is a guy that normally likes to use an aggressive striking approach, utilizing combinations and doing good damage and hurting his opponents and, picking up some decent experience along the way. However, I think he's going to be up against it here with Stots being the better grappler, and Stots should be able to not completely replicate what Danny Sabatello did. We know Sabatello is a little bit more relentless and doesn't mind desperation takedowns, but I do think we'll see Stots chain wrestle pretty well here, keep Breno in bad positions, and allow Stots to grind this fight out. I'm not so hot on the minus 600 because if Stots can't get this fight to the ground, I think Breno can do a good job in terms of taking advantage of the striking realm. But again, similar to the fight that I just spoke about earlier with Zaynukov and Sanders, I don't think Breno have many opportunities in the striking realm, allowing Stots to grind this fight out and win it on the scorecards. But again, I would think twice about parlaying that minus 600. All right, fun fight here, and probably the fight that I'm looking forward to most on this entire weekend slate. We got McKee Jr. coming in at minus 185, going up against Paul Hughes, who comes in at plus 160. Now, we'll start off on the 22-1 McKee side of things, who's coming off of a victory over Clay Collard back in February, where he was able to quickly get that fight to the ground, transition from a guillotine to a triangle choke to an armbar, and quickly got the tap from Collard all within 70 seconds. McKee has a decent distance striking game where he's able to utilize his length and reach to touch up opponents from distance, but it's also seeming like he's settling it at 155 pounds after losing the title to Patricio Pitbull back at 145 pounds. And I think that's better for him as he continues to grow and become older, not having to cut and kill himself to make 145, and he has the length, frame, and size to be competitive at 155 pounds. Obviously, growing up in the sport, McKee has a ton of experience, but I believe a lot of the matchups that he's had was kind of tailor-made for his style. I believe the Pitbull fight was probably the hardest of his career. Other guys he's been able to quickly finish or quickly submit, but I think he's going to be up against it here in a guy in Paul Hughes, who seems to be one of the more complete fighters that has been on the scene in a long time. Obviously, Paul Hughes got a ton of headlines over the last couple months as he was the biggest free agent on the market, putting together a tremendous run with Cage Warriors, avenging the only loss that he had by split decision as well. And, it was either between the UFC and PFL. And we know what the UFC does. UFC normally pays the kind of lowballs these guys and just entices them and say, hey, if you are as good as you think you are, you will become champion. And from there, your money-making ability is going to be limitless. Whereas PFL is like, hey, we know you're a great superstar already, so we're just going to pay you a fuck ton of money right now. And even if you end up losing, it's fine. We're tied to this contract. We'll still earn big money. So come join with us now rather than, maybe not making it to the top of the UFC. And that's what Paul Hughes decided to do here. And I will say, I do think he is good enough to get into the top 5 to 10 of the division if he were to have signed with the UFC, especially with the skill set that he brings to the table. But I don't blame the guy in a sport that's so... there's such a small window of time to make money, and if PFL is throwing the bag at him, I don't blame him for taking this shot. But this is a fight where he will choose to or have the opportunity to prove to most folks that he is ready for the top of the top right now, and finding a guy like McKee could, and possibly beating him, could definitely send that message. Smooth, slick striking, knocking out other strikers as well, has some deceiving power, good combination striking, good footwork, good timing and distance management, and he also has a very solid grappling game where he's been able to take opponents to the ground and just smash them from that top position. He has nasty elbows as well, which is kind of a question mark going into this fight, because we know PFL's rule set doesn't allow for elbows, but that's normally for their regular season and playoff matchups. So I wonder if for this pay-per-view they'll actually allow elbows, considering that this isn't your typical PFL card. So hopefully he's able to utilize it because it will be very effective for him to be able to do that. Now, I think McKee is going to struggle to keep Hughes at bay. I think Hughes has good footwork, cuts angles well, and I think he'll be able to crash the pocket enough to land those big shots on McKee, and I think that's going to ultimately be the difference maker in this matchup. I think we could also see Hughes maybe get some grappling going, but I would advise against that considering the slick and sneaky submission package and style that we've seen from McKee in the past. So I think it would all be about pressure for Hughes, crashing the pocket, landing big shots, and staying more active than McKee, who we've seen be a little bit too gun shy at times against guys that have some decent power. And he gave away rounds like he did to Patricio Pitbull. It wouldn't be surprising to me if he actually ended up giving away some rounds here to Hughes, who ends up landing better shots, more significant strikes, and optically pleasing strikes to the judges if this fight ends up hitting the scorecards, which I think it does. So I'm going to go Hughes by decision. The line's kind of gone all over the place. I think he was plus 200 opening, got bet all the way down to plus 130. Now he's stabilizing around plus 150, plus 160. I think it's a solid fight. And I think Hughes has a solid chance of pulling it off. Last thing I'll say about this, in my write-up, I said this would be either the best or second best fighter that AJ McKee has fought through his 23 fights. Same could be said for Paul Hughes. This is probably the best fighter that he's fought to this point. So it's a big proving spot for both of these guys, but I do believe in Paul Hughes' overall skill set and ability to crash the pocket and land some big damage. Give me Paul Hughes and Paul Hughes by decision. All right, next up, Hussein Kadimagomaev coming in at minus 1,200, going up against Zafar Mohsen, who comes in at plus 750. Very weird placement for this fight. I'm not entirely sure why. I think maybe they're trying to build up Hussein's notoriety. He's an 11-1 fighter with his only loss coming in a fight where he completely gassed out about halfway through that fight and then eventually got finished in the third round. And that's kind of been something that I picked up on in a lot of his fights. There was another fight where he almost lost, considering that he blew his gas tank in that second round, allowing his opponent to get some good top time, do a good job with landing some big takedowns of his own, stuffing the takedowns of Hussein, reversing those positions and getting on top of Hussein. But then Hussein latched onto a perfectly timed guillotine, which bailed him out of a bad spot and got him the victory. And that's Hussein's game. He is grapple heavy from jump. His striking is a little bit wild and erratic at times, but it allows him to close the distance and get a hold of his opponents and drag them to the ground, which is where he normally presents the most issues to his fighters. But if he faces guys that have good enough resistance and can defend against some of his grappling, he will start to slow down later on in fights, which has caused him issues. There'll be times where he will shoot desperation takedowns even when he is dead tired, and then when he doesn't come out with the takedown, he'll flop to his back and hope that his opponent follows him to the ground. Not a good look, in my opinion. If he can manage his gas tank a little bit better, then I can understand why he would be such a big favorite in this spot. He goes up against Zafar Mohsen, who, pretty much beating up on mediocre and tomato can fighters or guys that are just way too old. Has some decent power in his shots, has some decent grappling. I wasn't too mad at his performance against German veteran Max Koga back in August 2022, but just didn't seem to showcase the ability to take command of that fight. Even though he had some solid moments, it seemed like Koga was getting control the entire time. It seems that anytime Mohsen fights anybody with some legitimacy, he ends up coming up short, which is why it's hard for me to build much confidence to even take a little bit of a sprinkle on him at plus 750. If they do release round 3 props, I might take a little bit of a shot if we can get anything better than plus 1,500 or plus 2,000. But Kadimagomaev should do a good enough job in terms of controlling this fight, getting his takedowns, getting dominant positions, and I think he eventually latches onto a submission here to get the win. But no way should you ever trust anybody that has a bad gas tank, who, makes bad decisions the way Kadimagomaev has in the past, at anything worse at minus 500, and he's all the way up at minus 1,200. I plead with you, pass on this fight or take his inside the distance or by submission prop, but do not parlay him at minus 1,200, because if he does end up fumbling the bag here, it's going to be sad how little he actually impacted the parlay. And if he ends up being the bed shitter here, you only have yourself to blame if you end up parlaying him at minus 1,200. But I'll go Kadimagomaev by submission, but might poke Mohsen round 3 if they actually end up dropping that prop. All right, middleweight title rematch here. between champion Johnny Eblen coming in at minus 350, going up against Fabian Edwards, who comes in at plus 275. Now, Eblen is coming off a split decision victory over Impa Kasanganay back in February, and that was a fight where he had a solid first round, got rocked badly in the second round, but managed to rally back in that round, and then in the third round, picked up the pace and got the better of Impa, and eventually won that fight on the scorecards. Again, that might drop the stock for Eblen in a lot of people's eyes, but I was impressed with his ability to battle back from adversity and still end up getting the win and still winning a round after getting it hurt as badly as he did. We know Eblen is all about the wrestling, but he has improved his striking game at a very solid rate, which has made him be competitive against guys that still find themselves to be strikers. And, in the first Fabian Edwards fight, that was the case. Fabian did a good job in terms of stopping the takedowns, but even when they were at distance, we still saw Eblen getting the better of Edwards, even if it was just by a smidge. He was getting the better of the striker and was up on 2 rounds going into that third round before he found that finish in the opening 30 seconds of that third round. Again, it was an unofficial Big John McCarthy scorecard, so take that with a grain of salt, but I do think Eblen was doing enough to win the first 2 rounds in that fight, just not going about it the way that I expected it to going into that matchup. Now, Edwards, since losing to Eblen last year, has bounced back with a victory over Aaron Jeffrey, where he utilized solid defensive grappling and a defensive clinch game to keep Aaron Jeffrey from getting him to the ground or landing enough damage. And anytime they were out at distance, Edwards did a great job in terms of landing his striking and showcasing his striking advantage, and obviously landing more strikes and end up winning that fight on the scorecards. I do expect Eblen to win this fight once again. The fight was close, so it's hard for me to completely get behind the minus 350 again, but I do think we actually end up seeing this fight go the distance, and that's probably the spot that I'm most intrigued about in this matchup. I think we'll see, again, the same type of approach from Eblen in terms of trying to implement his grappling when he can, trying to get the clinch going. I think he'll be in command of this fight from jump, but I think we'll see a little bit more defensiveness from Edwards that will likely allow him to survive the full 25 minutes here, and I think that we see Eblen win this fight on the scorecards. Last time I checked, the Eblen by decision was around plus 110, plus 120, whereas a fight goes to decision or the over 4.5 as well was roughly around that minus 120, minus 125 range. I would take a little bit of that juice just in case Edwards does end up defending the takedowns well enough and getting the better of the striking realm, and he ends up winning on the scorecards. I would kick myself for not taking that little bit of juice on the fight to go decision rather than the Eblen by decision. So I'll go fight goes to decision as my favorite bet for this fight. I do think Eblen wins. Line a little bit wide for my liking, but I do think he ends up winning this fight regardless. So I'm going to go Eblen and Eblen by decision. Our next up, women's featherweight matchup here, as we have Cris Cyborg coming in at plus 130, and I can't believe I'm saying that. I don't think we've ever seen Cris Cyborg come into a fight as the underdog. She goes up against Larissa Pacheco, who comes in at minus 150. Now, we'll start off on the Cris Cyborg side of things, as 18 of her 22, let me get the statistic correct for you guys. 18 of her last 22 fights have been for a title. Absolutely crazy. We had the Felicia Spencer fight. That was a non-title fight. We had the one of her fights for Invicta was a non-title fight. And then there's a couple of the Strikeforce fights that were not title fights either. But for the most part, she has only been fighting the best that the promotions that she was with have been throwing at her. And she's pretty much defeated every single one of them with the exception of Amanda Nunes in what turned out to be an absolute war. And I think Cyborg got a little bit humbled that night. She probably should not have gone to war like that against Amanda Nunes, and she ended up coming out on the losing end. But for the most part, Cyborg has been an absolute dominator. She goes out there, utilizes her Muay Thai striking approach, a ton of power, a good pressure. For the most part, has shown good enough durability. Her grappling defense allows her to keep fights in the striking realm where she's normally able to command the respect of her opponents. And then from there, she's just able to just have target practice against most of her fighters or most of her opponents. She's 39 years old, and she hasn't competed. She's since April of 2022. She's only competed in MMA twice, but she has managed to fill that time with 4 fights in the boxing ring. So she's stayed active where she could. There seems to have been some issues with the PFL trying to keep her busy after they purchased Bellator, but luckily she's finally able to get into the cage this weekend and showcase that she's still one of the best women's fighters in the world. She goes up against Larissa Pacheco, who seemed to be playing second fiddle to Kayla Harrison for the, since 2018, I believe it was. But luckily she finally overcame that obstacle in 2022 where she was able to get that victory over Harrison and win that season. She repeated in 2023 by winning that season as well. And she's been sitting out ever since, hoping for the super fight against Chris Cyborg, which will likely put a solid amount of money into her bank account as well. Great striking, good offensive wrestling. Her defensive wrestling has a little bit of cause for concern depending the level of opponent she's going against. Obviously, as we saw in the Kayla Harrison fight, she's improving that aspect, but we still saw her lose a round in the 5th round against Marina Moknakina. Butchered her name probably. That was her last fight, which was for the PFL 2023 championship. But she still dominated the first 4 rounds, so it doesn't really matter. Good striker. Finally, growing into her body, being a complete 145er, and obviously she'll have the youth advantage in this matchup as well. But it's still hard for me to just wrap my head around the fact that Chris Cyborg is an underdog going into this fight. Obviously, Pacheco probably a little bit more active as of late. She's younger than her too. She might have a little bit of a speed advantage, but if Cyborg's durability holds up, as it has for the most part, and she's able to go out there and command the respect from Pacheco and land her big shots and make Pacheco consider, hey, I haven't gotten hit like this by anybody before. Cyborg could get the respect of Pacheco from jump, and she should be able to get back to her style of just controlling most fights and walking Pacheco down and landing big shots of her own. I don't think Pacheco has a good enough grappling game to put Cyborg in bad positions and keep her there. She might be able to land a few takedowns here and there, but I do not think she'll be able to keep Cyborg down. And I think from there, Cyborg should be able to control the striking scenarios, and I think she ends up battering Pacheco en route to a decision victory. I like Cyborg here, especially at plus money. I get she's 39 years old, but I still believe, just considering the shape that she's in and just her overall, it's hard not to take a bet on her as an underdog, even if it's against somebody like Larissa Pacheco. So give me Cyborg and Cyborg by decision. All right, main event time here as we have Francis Ngannou coming in at minus 240, making his return to the MMA cage for the first time in, I believe it was 3 years, January 2022, or was it 2021? I believe it was January 2022. Give me 1 second. I just want to quickly confirm. I should have this in my notes already. I'm not sure why I don't. January 2022, which is the fight where he defeated Cyril Gane by decision. Obviously we know what he's been doing, negotiating a new contract, getting with the PFL, leaving the UFC, getting those 2 big-time boxing matchups where he had a very close fight against Tyson Fury, which we know now likely was due to Fury not taking that fight seriously at all and ending up paying for it, still getting the window. And then the Anthony Joshua fight back earlier this year, I think it was only 7 months ago, where Joshua dummied him from jump and eventually finished him in the second round of that boxing fight. So Ngannou turns his attention back to MMA, having to fight for PFL, and we know what he's good at. He has big power and improving wrestling game, just as we saw in the Cyril Gane fight, but I'm not sure how effective that will actually be against somebody who expects him to grapple. I don't think Cyril Gane was expecting him to grapple at all, and also we know the shortcomings of Gane's defensive grappling game, obviously. But for the most part, Ngannou as a nuclear option looks to knock his opponents out, but you have to consider how deterred and how damaged he could be coming into this matchup after that knockout loss that he suffered in February or March at the hands of Anthony Joshua. And he's 38 years old. He's going up against Renan Ferreira, who won the 2023 PFL tournament, knocked out Denis Goltsov in the finals of their fight, got controlled for the first round with the wrestling of Goltsov, but then managed to get enough time in the striking round in the second round to hurt Goltsov and then eventually finish him. And then he went out there and defeated the Bellator heavyweight champion Ryan Bader in 21 seconds back in February, just showcasing how quick, fast, and explosive he can be. And that's the issue here in this matchup. Now, I get it. Francis Ngannou, tougher strength of schedule, a more popular fighter, has a nuclear option. I get why he's the favorite in the spot, but I still believe it's a little bit too wide here. You cannot overlook Renan Ferreira's speed, power, and size advantage here that could potentially come into play and allow him to land the big shots on Ngannou, who we just saw got knocked out 7 months ago. Right, so that's a big question mark here. This is a coin flip of a matchup. Maybe give the slight edge to Ngannou in terms of being a little bit better, technically speaking, but not by a whole lot. This is a close fight. This is a spot where I don't think anybody can really build up enough confidence to be like, this is a lock. So I'm actually going to go with the Ferreira side here. I'm going to take a very small shot half a unit, if that, on Ferreira at anything better than plus 200 here, because if he's the one that ends up landing first with the perfect shot, he gets his hand raised. The same thing can be said about Ngannou, but you're looking at, a much smaller payout should Ngannou be the one that finds the knockout here. So give me Ferreira by knockout, more active in MMA as of recently, has the possible speed advantage, has the length reach advantage. I believe it's only a 4-inch height advantage and a 2-inch reach advantage. But again, the speed and the power, Ferreira packs a punch as well. And considering the circumstances of Ngannou coming into this matchup, maybe he is damaged coming into this fight, and that could allow Ferreira to land the big shot. So give me Ferreira by knockout, but this is a coin flip. As much as you can put it, this is a coin flip. So let's try to take advantage of the plus 200 underdog here. There you guys go. Breakdowns for PFL Super Fights. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully we're able to cash some tickets here. A lot of chalky favorites, but I would suggest being as cautious as possible. Traversing that, I gave as much thoughts as I possibly could on most of these fights. And yeah, hopefully we're able to cash some tickets as part of this big weekend of MMA fights. UFC, PFL, KSW, LFA, CFFC, I believe, is also going down this weekend, but I don't break down that card. Yeah. Good luck this weekend, folks, and I'll see you guys again tomorrow for the Locky 2-step free parlay and the 3 best prop bets for the UFC. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.